It's new. It's different. It's the Business Forum every Tuesday afternoon at 3 o'clock with your host, communications specialist Sandrine Rattan. Find out what's going on in our various sectors and industries which impact positively on the socio-economic landscape both locally and regionally. The Business Forum with Sandrine Rattan.
Tuesday's guest is Caroline Atkinson, senior economist at the International Monetary Fund. The Business Forum complements the Venture Capital Incentive Program. A rebroadcast of Business Forum this Sunday at 2 p.m.
exclusively on Power 102.1 FM.
The Venture Capital Incentive Program provides entrepreneurs with an exciting vehicle for conversion of sound ideas into financially viable business enterprises. So do you have good business ideas or an existing business? Then contact us at 624-3068, 624-3079, or 624-3081, or visit our website at www.vcip.org.
All right, people, and of course, it's time for the Business Forum here on 102.1 FM. And so, my pleasure to say good afternoon to Sandrine Rattan, communication specialist, and of course, host of this beautiful program. Sandrine, good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon, Sir Charles. Good afternoon, Trinidad and Tobago, and to our listeners on the World Wide Web. Special good afternoon and welcome to our international counterparts at the IMF who are tuned into the program at this time. This afternoon, we'll be discussing the role of the IMF as well as key initiatives being undertaken by the organization. And my guest is Ms. Caroline Atkinson, who is one of the most senior economists at the International Monetary Fund. But before joining Ms. Atkinson on the line, I'd like to share her profile with our listeners. Caroline Atkinson assumed her current position as Director of External Relations at the IMF on November 1st, 2008. During her IMF career, Ms. Atkinson has worked in a wide cross-section of countries, as well as on policy issues in the European, Western Hemisphere and policy development and review departments. Prior to becoming Director of External Relations, she was Deputy Director of the Western Hemisphere Department. Outside the fund, she has held senior positions in key official and private sector organizations, including the Bank of England, the United States Treasury, the Council on Foreign Relations, and Stonebridge International. Ms. Atkinson has also worked as a journalist for the Washington Post, the Economist, and the Times of London. She graduated with a bachelor's degree with honors in philosophy and economics from Oxford University. So we now go straight online to Ms. Atkinson. Ms. Atkinson, welcome to the Business Forum. You are live on Power 102 FM in Trinidad.
Good afternoon. Very pleased to be here, Sandrine.
Welcome. Ms. Atkinson, the IMF is an international organization of the United Nations system. But before we proceed further into the roles and functions of the IMF, could you explain to our listeners the link between the IMF and the UN?
Well, first of all, just to explain that the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, and the World Bank were created 65 years ago, just after the Second World War, at the Bretton Woods in New Hampshire. It was a country residence where people from all over the world came to try to set up institutions that would stop the kind of economic problems that had happened in the 30s from ever being repeated. And when they were set up, they were nested within the United Nations system. So they share the same goals of raising living standards across the world as the United Nations, but they have a slightly different governance and so on structure than the UN itself or the other UN organizations like UNESCO. And in particular, the way that they're managed and run and the voting shares and so on are a bit different in the IMF and the World Bank.
And I guess, Ms. Atkinson, their mandates are different as well.
That's right. The IMF is primarily supposed to focus on macroeconomic and financial stability. We really try to help countries to have a steady and low inflation and fast growth without an imbalance in importing too much or too much government spending versus taxation, really trying to help countries have a steady macroeconomic basis, whereas the World Bank looks at more specific project lending, especially for poorer countries, and the World Bank's mandate is really to fight poverty and aid development. The IMF is active in all of its 186 member countries, because every country, not just the poor, but also the richer and emerging market countries, for all of them it's important to have a well-functioning and steady macroeconomic system that doesn't have too much inflation and that supports stronger growth.
Okay. And now, Ms. Atkinson, we can discuss the three main components of the work of the IMF, which are surveillance, lending, and technical assistance. Could you expand on each of these for us, please?
Absolutely. Well, perhaps I'll take the second one first, because it's the one that the IMF is most famous for, and that's the lending.
Correct.
And when countries are in trouble, they cannot manage to meet all of their bills, they have what's called a balance of payments crisis, maybe their currency is plunging in value, then they may come to the IMF and ask for financial support. And the IMF will discuss what sort of policies are needed to get the country out of crisis, and will lend some money for 3 to 5 years to help the country get back on track. And that's our lending role.
Yes.
And that tends to vary. At the moment, we've been lending a lot of money because of this economic crisis, whereas 2 or 3 years ago, we were making very few loans.
Okay.
Now, on the next point, which is our so-called surveillance role, this is one that continues all the time, year in, year out, for all of the countries, including Trinidad and Tobago.
Okay.
And I myself had the pleasure of visiting Trinidad and Tobago a couple of years ago to take part in our annual economic discussions with the government, with the central bank, to see what we thought of the policies that you were doing and how we could advise the government and the central bank on carrying out those in a good way, and also let you know what was happening in the rest of the world.
Yes.
And that happens every year with every country.
Okay.
We reach out also to parliamentarians, members of business, labor unions, civil society, to get a good all-round picture of the economic developments.
Okay.
And then finally, the technical assistance. The fund has many experts in very detailed aspects of tax collection or central banking, and we also have a big network of experts, so that we're able to go, if a country has a particularly detailed problem, they want some advice on how does another country deal with this, or how would we suggest that they address this issue, then we provide technical assistance. And again, we've done this for Trinidad and Tobago as well as for many other countries.
Excellent. I know that as part of its efforts to strengthen the international financial system, as well as enhance the effectiveness at preventing and resolving crises, the IMF applies both its surveillance and technical expertise in this regard. How does this process work?
Well, in our regular checkups of national economies, we pay close attention not just to what's happening in that country, but also to how what happens in a particular country may affect another one. For example, what the US does has a big impact on many other countries. And then within the Caribbean region, what happens, for example, what Trinidad and Tobago, what you do with your policies will have an impact on other economies nearby you. So we look at that both on an individual country basis and also in our regular World Economic Outlook, where we describe our projections for the global economy, our latest research on what has been affecting, what caused the financial crisis, for example. That is our surveillance role. Okay. We also look at how countries can strengthen, I mentioned their financial system, and how they can make themselves less vulnerable to bad things that might happen elsewhere. We're now working, for example, on setting up an early warning exercise which will help to indicate where problems may arise in the future, so that we're not taken unawares by a crisis, as most people were by this big economic crisis that we're now in.
Yes, yes. Ms. Atkinson, please stay on the line while we pause for a commercial break. When we return, we'll be discussing some of the key initiatives being facilitated by the IMF to treat with the socio-economic challenges being experienced by many nations at this time.
Okay, thank you.
The Venture Capital Incentive Program provides entrepreneurs with an exciting vehicle for conversion of sound ideas into financially viable business enterprises. So do you have good business ideas or an existing business? Then contact us at 624-3068, 624-3079, or 624-3081, or visit our website at www.vcip.org.
Welcome back to the Business Forum. If you're just joining us, my guest is Ms. Sandrine Rattan, Senior Economist at the International Monetary Fund in Washington, USA. Ms. Atkinson, welcome back.
Thank you, Sandrine.
Crisis lending has been increased, with lending commitments reaching a record level of US $157 billion. And this also included a sharp increase in concessional lending to the world's poorest nations. But, Ms. Atkinson, how was the apportionment done, and what are some of the nations which benefited from this particular activity?
Well, just taking the crisis lending first, because that accounts for the bulk of this new lending.
Yes.
We are ready to help any member country when they need it. And we discovered, or I guess the whole world found out last autumn, that many countries that had been managing fine suddenly ran into severe financing difficulties. They were unable to meet all of the payments that they had for imports and for bank loans.
Yes.
And one of the first that was in, many of these were in Europe, in Eastern Europe, Iceland, Hungary, Ukraine, Latvia, and then some in the more into further east, Georgia and Armenia. And we negotiated big programs where we discussed which policies the countries should put in place to mend their economies, and we lent them money to help them on their way with that.
Yes.
And we have, in many cases, gone through a second round with these countries. We also, with many of the countries in Eastern Europe, it wasn't the IMF alone, but we also lent alongside the Swedish government in Latvia, which is very closely tied, for example, to Sweden, and with the European Union
Yes.
to Hungary and elsewhere, because there are important interests in Europe to support those countries. Okay. And when we decide how much we're going to lend, that's based on a diagnosis of how much money countries need
Yes.
and discussions with the government. And typically, we have a certain request, and then we'll be negotiating about how much money the country needs and for how long. And we tend to give money out in what we call tranches. So you get some every quarter, depending on what the policies and the needs are.
Yes.
And just yesterday, for example, we increased the amount available to Belarus by $1 billion because it turned out that their needs have been greater than we thought this year. Now, turning to concessional lending, we felt early on this crisis from the U.S. hit the industrialized countries and then the emerging markets, but gradually it's had an impact also on the poorer countries.
Okay.
And that included many in Africa. So we found that we needed to raise the amount of lending to African countries, which has reached about more than $1.5 billion in the first 5 months of this year, compared to just over $1 billion for the whole of 2008, and much less than that in 2007.
Yes.
When we make a concessional loan, we have to use subsidy that have been given by richer countries to the IMF so that we can make very low interest rate loans over a longer term to the poorer countries. Because the last thing we want to do is to lend them money that puts them back into a debt crisis.
Of course. Of course. Given the current economic scenario, I note that the IMF's major focus has been to assist governments to protect and even increase social spending, including social assistance, and in particular, the promotion of measures to introduce social safety net programs, which can mitigate the impact of the crisis on the most vulnerable in society. What is the process involved here?
Well, just to say, there are a couple of points that we have been stressing, particularly in this crisis, that our programs need to be very focused on what is the most essential aspect, and then that we need to think about what we've called social conditionality. So in a crisis, economies, everybody gets hurt to some extent, but we want to make sure that the most vulnerable and the poorest in society are protected. And our mission teams that go out to countries discuss with governments what measures they should take to strengthen their budgets. But we also make sure that when they take these measures, which may involve cutting spending in some cases, that they preserve the spending on social programs that help the most vulnerable in society.
Yes.
And for example, in Pakistan, we allowed the government to borrow a half a percentage of GDP more than otherwise so that they could put in place a social safety net program, which they otherwise didn't have.
Yes.
In Belarus, I mentioned that we insisted that housing assistance for countries for families with 3 or more children should be made available, and that there should be housing subsidies and unemployment assistance should all be increased at the same time as the government was taking other measures to cut spending.
Okay.
In Costa Rica, fiscal policy has been geared towards supporting higher social spending, including with conditional cash transfer programs, which are programs where the government gives the family a certain amount of money on condition that things happen, like that children are sent to school or taken to health clinics.
Okay.
So the process is to go to each country, which we do in detail with each team, and work out what they particularly need, and then design a program that meets those needs.
Yes. Ms. Atkinson, in terms of the social safety net programs, is there a special focus, for example, on the region? Let's say those countries which are mostly affected by negatively affected by the crisis. Yes.
Yeah, well, in terms of our lending, we tend to see the countries that are most affected by the crisis. Those are the ones that need to come to us for help. Yes. And then in this crisis, we're making a particular effort when we're designing the programs to help those countries to make sure that they put in place steps to help the most needy. We don't tend to look at it on a regional basis so much as a country-by-country basis.
Okay.
Although, of course, we know that many of the poorest countries are in Africa, and in those cases it's particularly important to make sure that the poorest in Africa are taken care of.
Of course, of course. Now, I'm aware that the IMF is quite proactive with regards to the continuous gathering of market intelligence to inform of best practices, and perhaps it is against this background that the organization has done a major overhaul of its lending framework. Could you share with us some aspects of the revised framework?
Yes, absolutely. Well, the first aspect I touched on before, which is people are usually familiar with this notion of conditionality. Those are the conditions that we tend to require in exchange for lending. Yes. And we have moved to streamline this conditionality so that governments don't have too many different things that they're supposed to do, but we just make sure that whatever was the heart of the problem, for example, it could be a weak banking system, that's the area where our conditions are focused. So that's one aspect. The other aspect of streamlined conditionality is, as I mentioned, to include social conditionality.
Yes.
Then we have more broadly moved to we used to have a lot of different kinds of programs under which we lent to countries. There were standbys, there were longer term arrangements, there were a lot of different ways, and we've made all of those more flexible so that our traditional arrangements, you can borrow twice as much as used to be the rule. There is a simplified structure of interest charges and maturity. Yes. And some of the special facilities that we had that weren't used much, we just eliminated. And lastly, we created a very important new way of offering assistance, which is called the flexible credit line. Okay. And that is for very strong performing countries that have got a track record of reform, but who are nevertheless might become vulnerable given the very difficult economic environment that we've had recently. And 3 countries have applied for assistance under this flexible credit line. That's Mexico, Colombia, and Poland. Yes. And they don't draw any of the money. It's really more like a contingency credit line. You might get an overdraft facility or something from your bank. So that if you do need it, then you can draw on it pretty much automatically. And just putting that in place has helped to calm the markets, the financial markets, and reassure them that there won't be a big collapse in the emerging markets as a result of the problems in the U.S.
Yes, yes. Ms. Atkinson, I'm sure there is a lot more that you can share with us, but unfortunately we're approaching the end of our discussions. But what would you like to, what comments would you like to leave with our listeners in terms of closing?
I think the most important comment is to explain that we are very keen to help to support global growth and higher living standards around the world, and to do that through promoting better understanding in one country of another country's economic problems and policies. And we are open, we want to be as open as possible to hearing from people and interacting with governments and others so that we can do the best job possible in improving everybody's living standard.
Excellent. Ms. Atkinson, it was indeed a pleasure having you on the Business Forum, listening to you on our shows in Trinidad and Tobago, and continue doing a great job at the IMF.
Thank you very much.
We keep in touch.
Okay, yes, absolutely. All the best.
Goodbye.
Bye.
There you have it, listeners. Ms. Caroline Atkinson, who is one of the most senior economists at the IMF, sharing with us the work and some of the key initiatives which are currently being undertaken by the organization. Do have a good evening until next week.
The Venture Capital Incentive Program provides entrepreneurs with an exciting vehicle for conversion of sound ideas into financially viable business enterprises. So do you have good business ideas or an existing business? Then contact us at 624-3068, 624-3079, or 624-3081, or visit our website at www.vcip.org.